This is a demonstration that will show you how to assemble a straight waistband along the top of a skirt. The first step that we need to do is we need to assemble the skirt, and it's important to remember that on our skirt patterns here we have some darts. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to assemble my darts before I go ahead and close up the center back seam and the side seams, so that I'm just working with less fabric on each sample. So we have these darts here that you're going to want to make sure that you mark. And then we also have some notches which indicate the hip line of the skirt, and then we also have a marking a little bit lower along the side seam that is for the zipper placement, or just like any sort of access into your garment. So what you'll do is we'll actually be stitching and closing up the right side of the skirt, and we'll leave a good portion of the left side of the skirt open for getting into and out of the garment. And actually it's going to be easiest if we assemble the right side and then come back and leave the left side open, and we'll just sew this small portion closed at the very end so we can just open up our skirt and attach that waistband a little bit easier. So just make sure that you familiarize yourself with your patterns again. Again, on this skirt sample, we'll have a center back seam, and our front will be placed on the fold, so we'll have a distinct right and left. Also, there's a third piece to this sample, and this is the waistband. As you can see, you'll also need to place on the fold right here to have that be doubly long, and that there is this portion that's called underlap and overlap, which is that extension on the waistband where they overlap, and you would like place a skirt hook to keep your waistband tight around the top of your skirt there. There's also, I went ahead and just made a couple more notes on my pattern piece because there were more notes on the whole piece of paper that this pattern was on. So I just wanted to transfer them to my actual pattern itself so that I could remember that I'll need to line up this underlap overlap seam right here along my left side seam, and that where things are placed on the fold will be where I line things on my right side seam. And then again, I have my notches for the center front and the center back, and it's going to be a 3/4 inch high waistband because we'll fold that down, and then this will get sewn into the seam. So we'll have a fairly narrow waistband here. So also pointing out real quick that you're going to cut one of this of fabric and one of this of interfacing, and then depending on the interfacing that you use, you're going to want to go ahead and either fuse or sew that in. I've already cut my interfacing and just fused it right to the sample so that I didn't lose it in the process. So I would suggest doing that as you get started. What I have already done is I have already sewn a good portion of my darts in, but what I want to do is I'm just going to demo one more dart, and then I'm going to close up the center back seam and the right side seam, and then head over to the iron to get everything flattened out. So what I have is I have my markings along the back, and I also have indicated where those notches are on each side of the dart to go ahead and start that. So make sure that you, when you're folding your dart, that you're putting the right sides together, so you're seaming your dart along the back side or the inside of your skirt along the on the wrong side of the fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and match up my notches. I also use tracing paper. I use tracing paper to try to transfer those markings, but I'm going to follow my notches. It looks like when I was maybe laying these samples out that maybe there was a little bit of shifting on that lower layer because things aren't perfectly lined up with where my notches are. So I'm going to go ahead. What I did was I'm starting at the top, and I have my notches, as you can see here, lined up front to back, and then I just put a pin in to keep that hold, and then I also marked where the bottom of that dart is with this other pin. And I'm going to use the method that I showed you with closing straight darts, because that's what we're sewing here, about bringing that thread around front, and that gives you a guideline. So the first thing that we do is we're going to place our sample underneath, and I'm just going to go ahead and do a little bit of back stitching at the top of this dart, just a few stitches front and backwards, and then I'm going to, while my needle's in the down position, I'm going to raise up my presser foot, and I'm taking this top thread, which in my case it's kind of this aqua blue, and I'm angling it so that it touches this pin at the lower edge of the dart, and then since it's straight and I have my top thread pulled straight in a line to where that dart needs to end, I can use this thread as a guideline to follow. So I'm going to go ahead and start and just stitch right along that thread that I have held in place. And then as I get to the end of this dart, I'm going to pull out my needle that I had marking there and just finish running my my stitches off of the fabric, and then I'm going to go ahead and give myself a decent long tail, come back and trim my top thread tails that are held in place with that back stitching, and then I'm going to go ahead and tie this dart off. What I found to be fairly helpful is to kind of make that balloon knot type thing, and then as it's closing, as it's formed a loop right here, I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to push it right into the end of that dart, and then as I pull my thread tails, that dart will close and it'll be tight right there along the end of that dart, which is where we want it. And then I'm going to go ahead and just leave a little bit of thread tail there, maybe about a ½ inch, and then go ahead and take out my top pin. Now what you'll have is you'll have two skirt backs, and you'll know which one is the center seam because it's going to be on the straight of grain. You're going to have a very straight line, where along the hip side you should have that notched out for where the hip line was, and it's going to have a slight curve at the top near the waistline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and place my right sides of my fabric together, and I'm going to stitch this seam closed at 5/8 inch seam allowance. I also did a notch at the top here so I can match those notches up for where that 5/8 inch started, and then I can go ahead and run a row of pins up and down this center back seam to make sure that it is closed all the way. And I did some notches at the bottom just so I could make sure that those are matched up too. You could have easily marked this 5/8 inch seam allowance with tracing paper and a tracing wheel, which I had marked part of it down to that hip line, just to have some guide in case you know, I had some if my notches and stuff didn't line up. So what I'm going to do is I have my pins in place here, and I'm just going to sew this straight seam, starting at the top, doing some back stitching at the top and the bottom. Just a couple back and forth there, and then I'm running this raw edge of my center back along the 5/8 inch seam allowance guidelines on my throat plate and my bobbin cover. So I'm just going to I'm watching that that raw edge, making sure that it's running right along 5/8. Again, the right sides of my fabric are together while I'm stitching this seam closed. And again, it's always a good habit to make sure that you have your stitch length set to the proper settings, and so we want to be at about 2.5 to do all of our stitching today. When I get to the end, I'm just going to pull that fabric out and trim all my thread tails. And then what we need to do is we need to make sure that we are going to be seaming the right side seam. So I'm going to place this sample here with the right side up, and then I'm going to take my front skirt, which was cut on the fold. So as you can see, I don't have a center front seam, and I already have my darts closed here. And I'm going to hold this up to myself. I'm just going to act like I'm wearing this little skirt, and what I'm going to do is I want to close the right seam. So as I held this up to myself, I just held it straight up so that the right side was out facing me, as if this was a real skirt that I was making for myself. And I'm going to put a pin along the right side seam. Okay, so that's what I did here. My pin is along the right side seam, so I know which one I need to close. So as I put my right sides together for my skirt here, I'm going to match up the top. Match up the top of the skirt here. Go ahead and put that pin in, and then I'm going to close this right side seam. And if you have your notches marked, go ahead and make sure those notches are matched up, front and back. And then I just have to adjust this a little bit more because my edges are not matched up perfectly. And again, what I'm doing is I put my pins in right there along that 5/8 inch seam allowance marking. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm putting those in right along that 5/8 inch marking that I have partially identified down the edge here. And I'm just going to go ahead and continue lining up those raw edges along the right side seam. Typically when we have any sort of skirt or pant or short that does not have a center front or center back opening, so there's not a zipper in the center front or the center back, then you'll typically find your side seam zippers, which is what we're kind of accounting for, is if we were going to put in a zipper, it would be on the side seam, and it's typically always on the left along the left side seam. But you know, as you advance onto your upper level classes, you will have that authority to the design decision to be able to place your zippers wherever you want. But typically on skirts, they're along the left side seam. So I'm going to go ahead and insert my needle, and I'm sewing this seam along the 5/8 inch seam allowance, or the 5/8 inch markings on my throat plate and on my bobbin cover guide. And as I approach those pins, I'm just going to go ahead and pull them out as I get close to them. And I'm just going up and down, or I'm just going down this side seam from top to bottom. And I'm getting close to the bottom here, and then I'm going to be doing some back stitching at the end of this line. Okay. Alright, then I'm going to raise up that presser foot, trim those thread tails, then I'm going to go ahead and stop the video so that I can press things as they need to. I'm going to want to press this side seam open, and one thing that I found whenever you're pressing a curve, even if it's a slight curve like this, I always like to clip into those seam allowances just to help that curve between the top of the skirt and the hip line. I want to go ahead and just clip them to help to have that curve lay flat and fully press open as I want when I go over to the pressing ham. Another thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that these darts are pressed in the proper direction. These are all vertical darts, so vertical darts get pressed towards the center of your garment. Again, for the center back seam, I'm going to want to press that open and then press these darts towards the center. So when we come back, we're actually going to start pinning the waistband into place. So make sure that you have your waistband with the interfacing attached to it. Again, if you use fusible interfacing, you can go ahead and use the iron and fuse that to it. And if you have sew-in interfacing, then you're going to go ahead and stitch that around probably about 1/4 inch from the edge of both of the raw edges of your interfacing, as well as your actual fabric for your waistband. So the next video, that's where we'll pick it up.